Hey guys, it's Wave Nunnally here with Bible Unplugged, and I'm excited about sharing this next segment with you. You know, we typically, in dealing with backgrounds behind the Bible, we simply make the assumption that Jesus is a rabbi and he functioned as a rabbi, and we kind of move from there without really going back to square one and establishing the fact that that Jesus actually was and functioned as a rabbi. And because of that, we oftentimes don't really deal too much with the nuts and bolts of what it means to be a rabbi and to function in that capacity. So what I thought we would do in this segment today is that we would go back to that, square one, probably where all inquiry about all matters Jesus should begin, and do this on the basis of the evidence in the same way that we deal with pretty much any matter having to do with the Bible and specifically with historical Jesus stuff. So this segment's entitled Jesus the Rabbi for that very reason. We're going to go back to the beginning. So when you go to the how-to manual of Rabbinic Judaism, the Mishnah, you start hearing stuff about rabbi-disciple almost immediately. For example, in Tractate Avot, we hear the men of the great synagogue, basically this institution that started the rabbinic movement, if you want to think of it like that, said, raise up many disciples. So automatically right out of the chute, you hear about this kind of the responsibility of, kind of the definition of a rabbi is that they're able to attract disciples, to retain disciples, and to teach them appropriately. So raise up many disciples. Another text in the same tractate of the Mishnah says, Yehoshua ben Parachia said, provide yourself with a teacher. In Hebrew, it's aseh lecha rav. Make for yourself a rav, or that's the root word for rabbi. The I on the end simply means my. So my teacher or my rav would be the way you'd understand this in Hebrew. Provide for yourself or make for yourself a rabbi, and get for yourself a fellow disciple for the purpose of quizzing and going back and forth in study. Also in Tractate Avot, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was like one of the formative leaders of the rabbinic movement at the time of the destruction of the temple. We're talking AD 70. So a very, very important, very influential member of this rabbinic movement. And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples. So again, we're hearing all about this rabbi-disciple relationship, something we're going to talk about in a couple of segments. Great rabbis from the early times, they were known by the fact that they had disciples and maybe had many disciples. Rabbi Akiva, for example, mentioned almost 300 times in this earliest volume of rabbinic stuff, as it mentions him almost 300 times, is a very, very important and influential figure in Rabbinic Judaism, early Rabbinic Judaism. It's reported on multiple occasions that he had thousands of disciples. One text even says 42,000 disciples. So, probably an exaggeration, but the point is well made, and that is that rabbis are defined by their ability to attract, retain, and train disciples who study under them. Now, we're going to take a turn just a little bit. We're going to talk about this rabbi-disciple connection via the works of Josephus, a first-century Jew from the land of Israel, writing at the same time the New Testament, writing at the same time the Gospels are being written, and writing in the same Greek, the same developmental stage of Greek that we see in the New Testament and the Gospels specifically. Josephus is a great source for understanding backgrounds of New Testament realities because he's literally living it. He's a contemporary of the apostles. He says this about Jesus. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. All right? So anybody who's ever had any question about was he a real figure or was he kind of mythical like Robin Hood? puts it right into the bailiwick of this is historical reality. We don't have to have the Gospels to demonstrate that Jesus was a real historical figure living at the time that the Bible claims that he lived, and basically doing the things and saying the things that he said. So at this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and from other nations became his disciples. When you see that word, disciples, that means you have a 1st century BC or AD sage, a Second Temple period rabbi or teacher or sage. Because if you're able to attract, retain, and train disciples, you are by definition a rabbi. You don't have to be ordained. You don't have to graduate from some specific course of study. You don't have to have a certificate. You are a rabbi by virtue of your ability to attract disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. If you didn't know that the New Testament's claims about these things are corroborated or verified by material outside the Bible, well, great. You've had a good day at the office already, because now you know that. Josephus continues, those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. Notice the word disciple and discipleship. They reported that 3 days after his crucifixion, he was alive. Accordingly, because of this, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders or miraculous ministry. We have another text. This one is not from Josephus, it's from the rabbis themselves. This is from the Babylonian Talmud. The tractate is Sanhedrin or Sanhedrin. The rabbis taught Jesus had 5 disciples. Well, we know he actually had 12, but the point is, this is a text outside of Scripture, a rabbinic text that's telling us they recognize that Jesus was a 1st century sage, a 1st century teacher or rabbi, and that he had disciples. And then they began to name some of them. You might recognize Matthew, you might recognize Nicodemus. Buni is a little bit difficult, but probably refers to James and John, because Jesus nicknamed them B'nai Regesh, or the sons of thunder. That's probably, B'nai is probably where they get this Buni. Another text from the Talmud, in a different tractate, Avodah Zarah, says there's an ancient story, an ancient chunk of material handed down among our ranks of rabbis that recounts an incident involving a person named the son of Dama, in which a snake bit him. Following the attack, Yaakov, or James or Jacob, of the village of Sychania, who was a heretic, a disciple of Jesus. So we have another text outside the Bible that tells us about Jesus having disciples. Another text from the Babylonian Talmud, same tractate, Avodah Zarah, Rabbi Eliezer says, one time I was walking in the upper marketplace of Tzipori. Makes sense, because Tzipori, or Sepphoris, is 3.4 miles northwest of Nazareth. It's very easily within walking distance. You hardly break a sweat. And his name was Yaakov of the village, or Kfar Sychania. He said to me, Jesus the Nazarene taught me the following. And again, one of the disciples, so Jesus had multiple. We have this now on multiple accounts outside the Bible that Jesus was a trainer of disciples, meaning Jesus functioned as and was recognized as a rabbi. Here's another one. An incident involving Ben Dama when the snake bit him. There was a guy from Sychania, a heretic, a disciple of Jesus the Nazarene, came to heal him. Now let's take a look at some New Testament texts. You may not be aware of how many times Jesus is actually called by the title rabbi in the Gospels themselves. So here's a text from Matthew 26. Judas says, it's not I who's going to betray you, is it, Rabbi? Another one. Judas comes into the Garden of Gethsemane and he says, Rabbi, and kissed him. It's not just Judas that calls him rabbi. Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Or Peter said to him, Rabbi, behold the fig tree. You can take these passages down, go back and look if you like later on, if you want all the specifics, but this is just sort of a survey, so we're going to go through these pretty rapidly. Nathanael said in the Gospel of John, this is actually in John's Gospel where Jesus is called rabbi more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Nathanael answered and said to him, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. Rabbi, eat. Rabbi, when did you get here? More text, notice from John. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents? Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. Rabbi, and this is an important text right here. This is John 1:38. Rabbi, which translated means teacher. I put the Greek up here, didaskale. Didasko means to teach. This is the noun based on that, didaskale, teacher. Nicodemus came to him by night. Now this is important also because Nicodemus is a rabbi himself. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. He's a member of the party of the Pharisees. He's a leader of the party of the Pharisees, which means he's a rabbi. And he himself calls Jesus rabbi. We know that you've come from God as a, notice again the connection, teacher, because no one can do the signs that you do unless God is with him. Really interesting literary data that we've got there. In the Gospel of Matthew, we hear more about Jesus. They were amazed at his teaching, about his teaching ministry, for he was teaching the people as one having authority. Now, so let's take a look at Jesus the teacher. Jesus was a really well-versed person in his own Bible. And by Jesus' Bible, we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, what Christians today call the Old Testament. And so he's going to learn a lot about how to communicate, about word choice, about even literary forms that he chooses to use to communicate his message. One of the most prominent literary forms that Jesus teaches, that Jesus uses, is parable, of course. But one that's even more frequent in Jesus' ministry than parable is Jesus' use of what is called poetic parallelism. It's saying the same thing, making the same point with two different sets of words. Multiple lines basically repeating, making the same point, or building on the first line and clarifying more the more runs that you take at a specific point. So I thought we would take a look at a couple of passages we know Jesus would be familiar with for various reasons, and take a look at some passages in the Old Testament to see how they function. So we're going to look first at Isaiah chapter 1, verse 4. You know that Jesus, for his very reason for being, quotes Isaiah 61 in his homecoming sermon at Nazareth, as recorded in Luke chapter 4. So we're going to look at a passage in Isaiah, then one from Psalms. In Isaiah, Isaiah says, "Alas, O nation." And then in the next three lines, you're going to have nation, people, offspring, and sons. All of that is basically poetically parallel. So, alas, nation sinful. And then in the next three lines, he's going to go at it a different way or amplify this sinful nation. People of iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. You see, this is four ways of saying the same thing, just sort of building on the first point at each successive line. Then in the next little section, they have abandoned. Notice the they have. I've lined that up, kind of put this together intentionally so you see the parallel points. They have, abandoned, despised, and turned away. You see how these are parallel. They've abandoned the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and Him. So all of this is just a beautiful example of poetic parallelism that as Jesus reads, as he studies, as he memorizes, as he meditates on, as he then begins to teach, go over and over. He is very familiar with not only these texts, but also the literary forms of this kind of expression. Let's take a look at another one. This is Psalm 22. We know Jesus is familiar with Psalm 22 because he quoted the first verse as he hung on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? So let's take a look at this passage, and this is verse 24 of chapter 22, and see if maybe looking at the literary form in which a thing occurs will help you us to better understand the message of that chunk of material. So, Psalm 22, for he has not despised or abhorred, these are synonyms, the affliction of the afflicted, neither has he hidden his face from him. So many people are convinced that when Jesus took the sins of the world upon himself as this final ultimate sacrifice, that because of that, God had to turn his back on him. Well, I've written an article down here, and again, you can go back and look at the video, and you can write this URL down, go and read the article if you're interested in following up on this. But in the very same psalm that Jesus says, quotes, my God, why have you forsaken me? In that same psalm, the psalmist says, but now I realize, after thinking about how good God is and how He's faithfully taken care of Israel even when they turned their back on Him, He never turned His back on His people. And also, I thought about my own life. I'd been cast upon God since my birth, and God never has let me down. He comes to this realization, even though I thought I had been abandoned, He has not hidden His face. And He heard when he cried. You see, Jesus continues to cry out on the cross, saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And so if Jesus knew that God had abandoned him, he would have stopped praying, but he doesn't. All of that's in that article. Feel free to take a look at it at your own, if your own interest dictate that. We're going to continue with this study of poetic parallelism. All the ends of the earth and all the families of the nations will remember and turn to the Lord, will worship before the Lord, because the kingdom is the Lord's and He rules over the nations. Just poetic parallelism after poetic parallelism after poetic parallelism. So much of the Bible is written like this. Lots of poetry in the Bible. Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, etc. And then also in the prophets, as we saw in Isaiah, as we're seeing in the Psalms here. Lots of poetic parallelism. So this has gotten down inside of the DNA of Jesus. This is how He understands divine communication is disseminated, is revealed. And he begins to think that way himself. And when he teaches using that same kind of poetic parallelism. Take, for example, Matthew 11. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's two ways of saying exactly the same point. I'm sure you would agree. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. How about another one? It gets a little bit more complex as we go down through our examples. Matthew 11 again. We played the flute and you didn't dance. We sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. It's two ways of saying the same thing. Another, give to him who asks of you and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Two ways of saying the same thing. Now, or building on, clarifying the first point with each successive line in the piece of poetry. He causes the sun to shine on the evil and the good. He sends the rain. See, causes sins. He sends the rain, sun. He causes the rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous. Evil and the good, righteous and unrighteous. It's basically making the same point. Here's a more complex one. Don't lay up for yourselves treasures upon the earth, later on in letter A and then letter A1, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. So these are poetically parallel. B, where moth and rust destroy. B1, where neither moth nor rust destroys. This is kind of giving the antithesis, the opposite. And where thieves break in and steal, and then C1, where thieves do not break in and steal. Beautiful ABC poetic parallelism. And he will use different types of parallelism, poetic parallelism, in the same way that the psalmist or the prophets will use different types of, sometimes it's ABAB, sometimes it's ABBA, sometimes it's ABCBA. It's just a beautiful way that there's a variety of approaches to doing this work of creating a poetic parallelism. Here's another, by the way. Jesus is not quoting Bible here, but he's using the same literary form. What that means is he's not just able to read and understand it when the psalmist or one of the prophets uses poetic parallelism, but he's so well versed that he's able to do this on his own, create his own parallelisms instead of simply quoting biblical Hebrew Bible parallelisms. No one can serve two masters. That's poetically parallel with you can't serve God and mammon. That's riches, or not just riches, but that's possessions. For he'll either hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to the one and despise the other. So again, you've got a beautiful ABBA poetic parallelism there. These two things, the beginning and the last statement, are parallel, and then the two middle ones are parallel with one another, just varying his serve. Now, he says, don't give what is holy to dogs, and don't throw your pearls before swine. All I've done is formatted it in a way that makes the parallelism so much more obvious than if you're just running all the words together. Here's another text from Matthew 8. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, and figs are not gathered from thistles, right? He's even using the word, this is called ellipsis, or using the verb, kind of borrowing it from here down to the second line, so that he doesn't even have to state the verb at the second run through. Grapes and figs, thorns and thistles. Beautiful parallelism. Foxes have their holes and birds of the air have their nests. Another beautiful poetic parallelism, even incorporating imagery from the animal kingdom. Now, here's the last one that we're going to look at. This is a beautiful poetic parallelism. It's a little bit more extended, and so it's more complicated. That's the reason that I've put the A, B, C, D, and then he's going to repeat B, C, and D, and B1, C1, and D1. So maybe you've never looked at it like this before, but take a look at this well-known passage of Jesus' teaching. Jesus says, enter by the narrow gate. And then this is where all the parallelism starts. The gate is wide and the way is broad. Down in B1, the gate is small and the way is narrow. The gate is wide where? That leads to destruction. The C down here, that leads to life. You see how these are the kind of antithesis, or they're the opposite of one another? That leads to life. And few are those who find it. Many are those who enter by the wide gate that leads to destruction. Few are those who find it. Absolutely beautiful. I hope that you see in this kind of teaching methodology exactly what Jesus intended. Number one, he's communicating to an audience that's very biblically literate, and they are going to resonate with this. That will be attractive to them. They're used to it. They're comfortable with poetic parallelism because it's been read to them since they were able to understand spoken language, and they're familiar with this. Number two, Jesus is doing this because the repetition aids the memory. It helps you to memorize. Kind of like, what do we know best by heart in our culture? Songs. And why is that? It's because the chorus repeats itself, yeah? And we usually know the chorus better than the rest of the song. A final thing is that, as you can see, the deeper you go into the parallelism, the better you understand the point that the person is trying to make. And so one is that it's a comfortable way to do revelation, to disseminate your teaching. People are used to that. Another is it's easy to remember. A last is it's better or easier to understand. So Jesus is all over this. Well, you can tell then that Jesus is highly literate. He's an incredible teacher and communicator. He's in touch with his culture. He's in touch with his Bible. He's in touch with his audience's needs and the way that they need to receive information. All of that is really good information about Jesus, and he's willing to go there. Wherever we are, he's going to meet us right there. That's a great takeaway point, just that. But it gets even better, because sometimes this poetic parallelism will help us out of difficult interpretive or applicational situations because of the capacity that it has to clarify, to make incredibly clear what might otherwise seem to be a very difficult call for us to make in terms of, does it mean this or could it mean that? Let me give you one quick example where this particular literary form helps us to get out of a tight situation and to connect it to everything else that we get in the Bible. And I think that you're going to appreciate this big picture. So, Matthew chapter 7. This is the most popular verse quoted today. It used to be John 3:16. Unfortunately, in our permissive society, in our more postmodern kind of, I make up my rules as I go along, it's whatever pleases me, this really resonates with our world. But this has become the most quoted verse in the entire Bible. Don't judge lest you be judged. You've heard that before? Well, people that are making that call are quoting Jesus. So basically what that means, or what they intend it to mean, is, hey, you keep your hands off of me, you run your own life, I'm going to make up my own rules. Don't impose your standards on me, I'll make my own up on as I will, as I'm interested in. But is this exactly what Jesus is saying? Suspend all careful, analytical, or critical thinking. Don't ever distinguish between or prioritize or select one thing and reject another thing or person or situation or group or way of life or job or major or class. No, he's not saying that. In the same passage, chapter 7 of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus will say, don't cast your pearls before swine, don't give the dogs what's holy. That sounds like it's requiring that we make some sort of, careful assessment of who are dogs and who are swine and what is pearls and what are pearls and what happens to be what's holy. He'll also say in the same passage, beware of false prophets. He's like, well, how am I supposed to not judge and then I'm supposed to be careful about people who want to mislead me? It's like you can't have both, can you? Has Jesus sort of lost it there in the Gospel of Matthew? Thankfully, this is not all that we have. Chapter 7 of Matthew is not the only version of this that I think Matthew is giving to his very literate audience, a sort of a shorthand version of what Jesus said, because they'd figure it out, they would remember it. This is just kind of a prompt to the memory, and you just get started on the song, and then the audience can sing the rest of the verse. But we actually have a parallel account. We have Luke's version of what Matthew says in Matthew 7. We have it in Luke chapter 6. Now watch what happens when you use this principle of Hebrew or Hebraic poetic parallelism as a means of interpreting or better understanding or clarifying these really important words of Jesus. So in the Matthew 7, it's just judge not lest you be judged. In the Luke 6 version, we have, yes, judge not and you will not be judged, but look at what Luke has added. All of this extra stuff was just sort of assumed by Matthew and not communicated in writing. It's kind of between the lines. His audience would have gone there because they had their memory kick-started. So Luke says, when Jesus says, judge not lest you be judged, he follows that up, says, don't condemn and you won't be condemned, and pardon and you will be pardoned. And so what Luke is telling us that Jesus is trying to communicate is, don't you be issuing condemnatory, unforgiving judgment. See how these all run together? this is the initial statement, and these two clarify or put some parameters around what Jesus is saying to not do. He's saying, don't you be issuing to the rest of God's creation, condemnatory, unforgiving judgment. Now, I've written an article on this a long time ago. This takes us all the way back into the previous millennium, 1997, but it's still out there on the internet. And guess what? You can go back and watch this video, and you can write down this URL, plug that into your search engine, and this exact article will come up that will give a full discussion. In the same way that the earlier one talked about, why have you forsaken me? This article will go into more detail, more Bible passages integrated, and you'll get the full meal deal on Jesus' intended meaning in Matthew chapter 7 as well as in Luke chapter 6. Well, I trust that this study has enabled you to get onto the foundation, the groundwork of why we make these assumptions. And we've done other videos where, well, Jesus was a rabbi, Jesus had disciples, Jesus was a teacher of many people. And now we've built that from the ground up, and we've done it on the basis of the evidence. I also hope that you've come to the conclusion that Jesus is not some kind of uneducated Mediterranean peasant like we get in some of the scholarly literature written on Jesus. But rather you've found him to be a very articulate, highly literate, incredibly biblically trained, excellent memory, and has the ability to not only quote the Bible when the Bible speaks in poetic parallelism, but also to make up his own. He's incredibly creative and a great communicator. That's the kind of Jesus that gave his life for us, and that's the kind of Jesus we've committed our lives to serve. Another thing that I'm hoping is that you see that coming to understand some of the literary forms that writers of Scripture will use actually helps us in terms of interpretation, and in some instances actually gets us out of a tight, where it seems like part of Matthew 7 contradicts what Jesus says in other parts of Matthew 7. How can this be? Well, what we've seen is that Jesus is saying, no, just don't be ripping on people just for the fun of it, or to get a notch in your belt, or to, exalt yourself at someone else's expense. But when we look at someone, we need to get the beam out of our own eye before we take the fleck of sawdust out of someone else's eye. We've actually got down to a point where this is the way Jesus has called us to live. And it doesn't get any more basic, any more foundational or fundamental than that. So I'm hoping that this study that we do, as we break down these various aspects of Jesus the Rabbi, are going to help put a lot more things in their proper place and give us a clearer perspective on this most important life ever lived on this planet. I trust as you continue to seek Him, He's going to show Himself. Seek and you will find. He's going to show Himself to you, and that God is going to continue to grow you in His grace and equip you to be the kind of representative that He has called you and me to be out in His world. So, the Lord bless you in the coming week. May His face shine on you, and may you grow in His grace to become a more effective representative for this Jesus in His and our world. God bless. Have an awesome day serving Him. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch our videos. If you're benefiting from the content that you're receiving from them, please make sure that you're following us on Facebook and that you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you never miss a thing. While you're at it, share our content with your friends and family. Encourage them to follow us as well. Thanks for helping us to reach as many as we can with a powerful message of God's Word in its original context.